Hey guys, tonight we slip beneath the scratchy wool blankets of a time when romance came with fleas, matchmaking meant political gain, and bathing was an annual suggestion. You're about to explore the medieval bedroom or at least try to where candles flicker in drafty stone castles, and privacy is a luxury almost no one can afford. There's no scented lotion, no Spotify playlist, and no real concept of personal space. And honestly, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your evening not in the warmth of a duvet, but tucked into a straw mattress alive with bugs. The room smells faintly of wood smoke, mold, and something human, maybe even something horse-related depending on your station in life. You shift under a coarse linen sheet and wonder, how did people ever get in the mood in this? Well, first of all, they often didn't. Sex in the medieval period was less about sparks and more about duty, reproduction, alliances, salvation. Your body wasn't really your own, it was part of the village, part of your family's reputation, and definitely part of God's business. People didn't separate body from soul. The church certainly didn't. And the soul was very nosy. The dominant force over your desires? The medieval church. It loomed large, louder than lust, with rules that micromanaged not just your behavior, but your thoughts. Thought about someone attractive while praying? Sin. Looked too long at someone in the market? Sin. Touched yourself? Sin. 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 Followed by confession and possibly a terrifying penance involving fasting or a public whipping if you were lucky. Still, people found their ways. Love existed, yes, but in strange containers. You'd think romantic feelings were universal, but in the 11th or 12th century, they were seen more as distractions from God's light. The idea that people should marry for love? Laughably modern. Back then, you married because your families arranged it, or because your land needed defending. Falling in love was considered suspicious, a weakness, potentially demonic. That's right, Cupid with horns. And yet, despite all this repression, or maybe because of it, desire didn't disappear. It slunk in the shadows, shaped by rules, sneaking out in poetry, dreams, and occasional scandal. Medieval people weren't robots. They had crushes. They flirted, badly. They fumbled their way through intimacy without anatomy textbooks or emotional vocabulary. You probably wouldn't have had the talk growing up. More likely, you'd piece things together from barnyard observation, bawdy jokes, and terrifying warnings about hell. So, you're lying in that scratchy bed. Maybe you're in a castle, lucky you. The bedposts are carved, the walls hung with tapestries to try and keep out the chill. You're nobility, which means you've probably bathed this season. Or maybe you're a peasant in a one-room hut, sleeping five to a bed. Either way, you're surrounded by reminders that your body doesn't entirely belong to you. One historical fact that's both boring and mildly depressing. By the high Middle Ages, canon law had already mapped out the do's and don'ts of bedroom conduct in detail. Sex during Lent? Forbidden. On Sundays? No. On feast days? Definitely not. During daylight? Ugh, sinful. With clothes on? Acceptable. With enjoyment? Tread carefully. Missionary only. Anything else was labeled sodomy, which was a catch-all term back then for anything not strictly for procreation. The church was less interested in your love life than your soul's real estate value. But here's the quirky bit. In some places, especially in early medieval Ireland, monks recorded confessions that show people getting creative with boundaries. There are records of people confessing to things like laying beside a woman without sin or resting my hand too long on a shoulder. Basically, people played weird theological twister with morality, hoping not to land on eternal damnation. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly more repressed or just differently expressive. Some think all the rules created an underground culture of secret indulgence, like naughty drawings, in the margins of religious manuscripts. Yes, those exist. Or erotic riddles in Anglo-Saxon texts. Others think that the average medieval person accepted the rules and genuinely internalized them. Maybe they found peace in that simplicity. Or maybe they just didn't have time to think about their feelings while trying not to starve. Still awake? Let's take a moment to imagine a medieval wedding night. You're young. You've maybe spoken 3 times to your new spouse. The bed is stuffed with hay, and your new in-laws are either standing outside the door or worse, inside the room, witnessing to ensure the marriage is consummated. Nothing says romance like your mother-in-law giving you the thumbs up mid-coitus. And for the poor, privacy isn't even on the menu. A small hut might house 6 to 10 people. Children, grandparents, animals. A married couple might have to coordinate intimacy between chores while pretending the family goat isn't watching. Let's just say foreplay didn't make the medieval priority list. That said, not everything was dire. Love songs circulated. People did write poetry. Courtly love, though its rules were bizarre and mostly performative, gave people a safe framework to feel something. Knights scribbled painfully awkward poems to their lady loves. Women gave tokens a glove, a ribbon, a half smile across a banquet table. For a few, feelings bloomed. They just had to navigate a minefield of religious guilt, social expectation, and terrible personal hygiene. By the way, deodorant didn't exist. The closest you'd get might be a sachet of herbs tucked into your robes, or a quick rub of rosemary sprigs. Kissing someone meant sharing breath that probably smelled like turnips and raw onion. And yet, people still found ways to fall into bead ore, onto hay piles, or behind a barn. So here you are, in the flickering candlelight, lying next to someone you may not love, possibly married to for political reasons, with a priest's disapproving voice echoing in your memory. And yet, desire lingers. It always has. You wake up to the echo of distant church bells tolling across a gray, dew-drenched morning. In medieval Europe, that sound isn't just marking time, it's marking control. Specifically, control over you, your thoughts, your meals, and yes, even your genitals. The bells don't just tell you when to pray. They tell you when not to play, especially in bed. Welcome to the age of chastity and clergy, where the church has a full monopoly on your morality. And let's get this out of the way. Yes, we have to talk about chastity belts, the spiky metal underwear of historical legend. You've seen them in museums, comedy sketches, and bad costume parties. But here's the kicker. Most historians now agree they're probably a myth, or at the very least, a later Renaissance invention that became popular in retrospect, mostly as a joke. Sort of like if someone in 500 years found a Victorian-era corset and assumed women actually fought dragons in those. Still, the idea behind the chastity belt? Very real. Control, especially of women's sexuality. In a world where land, titles, and power passed through bloodlines, ensuring a woman's purity wasn't just patriarchal nonsense, it was economics. You couldn't let emotions, or heaven forbid attraction, compromise a noble inheritance. So people found ways to symbolically lock things down. You, dear listener, are not immune to these expectations. If you're a young woman in this period, your virginity is quite literally your most prized possession. Not your intelligence, not your wit, not even your embroidery skills, though those help. It's the unbroken state of a thin membrane that determines whether your dowry holds its value. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? And if you're a man, your job is to protect your family's honor by not getting distracted by women who might, be breathing near you. Male chastity wasn't demanded quite as brutally, but don't get too cocky spilling seed outside of marriage was still a fast track to confessional shame and perhaps a dose of self-flagellation, or worse, a fine. In some towns, you might even be subject to public shaming. The stocks weren't just for thieves. Now let's talk logistics. The medieval church was obsessed with timing. You couldn't just do the deed whenever the mood struck. There were over 100 days per year on which sex was officially banned. That's right, Sundays, Lent, Advent, feast days, days before communion, days after communion, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were all off limits, which, if you're doing the math, leaves what? Mondays? Even within marriage, sex had to be for procreation, not pleasure. Fun fact: lust was considered one of the 7 deadly sins. Even if it happened within marriage, too much enjoyment could still stain your soul. So yes, your awkward fumbling in the dark better be mission-oriented, like literally missionary position. Anything else was frowned upon, if not outright heretical. And while we're on the subject of position, get this: the church hierarchy actually ranked positions in terms of acceptability. Missionary? Tolerable. Woman on top? Risky after all, that implied dominance. Rear entry? Absolutely not, unless you wanted to get compared to farm animals, which, in medieval sermons, was not uncommon. That brings us to one particularly uncomfortable rule. Some clerics claimed that too much intimacy, even with your spouse, could weaken your soul and your body. There were treatises warning that sex drained your life force. Want to fight in a crusade? Stay chaste. Want to live a long life? Avoid women. One famous 13th century physician claimed that emission of seed caused memory loss, fatigue, and even premature aging, which sounds suspiciously like something a grumpy monk made up after catching feelings. Here's where things get a little strange. Although the church discouraged lust, they were obsessed with documenting it. Manuals like the Penitentials, sort of an early sinner's handbook, listed every possible sexual sin you could commit and the precise penance required. Some of them read, like medieval BuzzFeed quizzes: did you touch yourself during Lent? 10 days of fasting? Used your left hand instead of your right? 3 days of cold baths and prayer. Accidentally made eye contact with a pretty widow? Good luck with that one. Historians still argue whether these manuals reflected actual practice or were more idealized checklists like the medieval version of terms and conditions nobody really read, but everyone pretended to follow. There is also the fringe belief, floated in rare cases, that demons could tempt people in their sleep, especially women. These seductive spirits, called incubi and succubi, were blamed for nocturnal emissions and unholy dreams. So if you woke up sweaty and confused, not your fault. Demon. To avoid this, some monks slept with their hands tied or wore shirts fastened tightly at the waist. Yes, they took sleepwear very seriously. You might want to consider a nightshirt with 20 buttons, just in case temptation came calling. And yet, despite this pressure cooker of repression, people didn't just stop wanting each other. You might sneak glances at the baker's apprentice. You might exchange a piece of bread for a smile too long. You might feel warmth bloom in your chest, even if your priest warned against it in Sunday's homily. Here's a quirky detail. In some regions, young couples could engage in a practice called bundling. Imagine this: you and your sweetheart climb into bed together, fully clothed, with a wooden board or sack sewn between you. It was meant to allow talking and bonding while preventing anything else. Unsurprisingly, it sometimes failed spectacularly, and even noblest, those draped in furs and etiquette, had their secrets. There are whispers in court records of scandalous affairs, illegitimate children, and hastily hushed rumors involving stable boys and chambermaids. Chastity was for display. Behind closed doors, people were still people. So as the bells ring again and dawn fully breaks, remember this: sex in the medieval world wasn't just physical. It was political. It was spiritual. It was terrifying, regulated, mythologized, and still, despite all that, sometimes real. Two people, sharing warmth in the dark, whispering against the rules. You squint against the smoke, curling from a peat fire, huddled in a cramped, earth-smelling hut that's more barn than home. Tonight, you're no noble or knightior, just a peasant. And when it comes to love and sex, your experience is as raw and practical as the dirt floor beneath your feet. Forget candlelit trysts and flowing silks. This is the real medieval bedroom, if you can even call it that. You're sleeping in a one-room structure made of wattle and daub, stuffed with your entire family, possibly a few cousins, and sometimes the cow. There's no bed as you know it, just a pile of straw, maybe topped with a ragged wool blanket if your harvest was good. And yes, the goats do watch. Intently. Sex here isn't about fantasy or romance. It's often just part of life's grim machinery, like sowing turnips or hauling water. You don't make love, you just make do. If you're lucky, there's affection. More often, there's obligation. Marriages among peasants are usually arranged within the village, not by lords, but by parents seeking security, labor, and more hands to work the land. Let's be honest, you're probably marrying your neighbor, or your neighbor's daughter, or the widow across the road who's still got a bit of land and a strong back. Love might grow in time, but nobody waits for butterflies. If your partner's strong, soberish, and unlikely to die of the pox next spring, you've hit the jackpot. Now picture the act itself. There's no privacy. If you've got kids, they're right there. If you're the kids, your parents aren't exactly sneaky. Sex is whispered about, but rarely hidden. You'd think all this exposure would breed openness, but no modesty rules. Under all that grime and practicality, there's still a deep-rooted shame, taught by priests and reinforced with every sermon. Mainstream fact break. In many parts of Europe, especially rural France and England, it was common for newlyweds to consummate their marriage with witnesses. No, not in bed with them, but right outside the room, listening. Sometimes a priest or neighbor would even dip fingers into the marriage bed afterward, inspecting sheets for proof of virginity. You didn't just get married, you got verified. And here's where things get weird. Even without modern medicine or reliable birth control, peasant families often had 5, 6, sometimes 12 children. Why? Because infant mortality was high and extra hands meant survival. But that also meant frequent pregnancies, miscarriages, and deaths in childbirth. Sex, for many women, was a gamble. Intimacy came with real risk. For a man, sex was proof of strength and masculinity, but that didn't mean he had much choice. Refuse your wife too often, and the village might start talking. Impotence could even be grounds for annulment. There's a documented case of a 14th century French court that ordered a man to prove his virility on command in front of court-appointed witnesses. No pressure. But even here, in the muck and smoke and grind, people found moments of joy. Laughter over a shared drink. A stolen kiss behind the bakehouse. The thrill of a festival, where inhibitions sometimes gave way to dancing, singing, and the occasional regrettable tryst in a hayloft. Fringe tidbit for you. During certain rural festivals like Beltane in the Celtic regions, it wasn't just allowed to engage in premarital sex. It was almost expected. Some areas even had customs where couples would go into the woods for the night, returning the next morning with the understanding that any resulting pregnancy would be accepted, even honored. Nature and fertility were deeply intertwined in these pre-Christian rituals, though the church worked hard to stamp them out. But historians still argue whether such freedoms were common or just the exception. Some believe they represent holdovers from older pagan cultures. Others argue that even if they existed, they were heavily regulated or eventually rebranded into moral tales. Did Beltane ever really let villagers off the hook for their escapades? Or is it just a romanticized fantasy we cling to now? And speaking of fantasy, forget lace or corsets. If you're imagining medieval peasants undressing seductively, slow it down. Clothes are functional, hard to remove, and rarely washed. Your tunic probably smells like onions and sweat. If you wear a chemise to bed, it's because it's your only one, and you're trying to keep lice off your skin. Bathing, infrequent. You might scrape yourself with a dull knife or wash in a freezing stream. Herbal steams are a luxury, and shared bathhouses are few and far between. So you learn to live with smells, yours and everyone else's. And yet, life goes on. People pair off. People fall in love or something like it. There's humor too. Medieval jokes survive in plays and folk songs, often crude, often hilarious. One favorite, a story of a man who brings a love potion to his wife, only to discover it's just vinegar and garlic. Her response? I liked you better when you stank. Still, not all unions are harmless. For some, especially women, sex isn't a choice. Marital rape wasn't a legal concept. Consent wasn't discussed. If your husband wanted you, that was that. Resistance could mean beatings or accusations of disobedience. You weren't seen as a partner. You were part of the household inventory, along with the goat, who is still watching, by the way. And yet, for all its hardship, some relationships worked. Couples grew fond of each other. They teased, sang together, shared the work. Maybe your husband carved you a spoon. Maybe your wife tucked a flower in your hood before market. Little things. Quiet affection. You made do. So you turn over in your shared straw bed, trying not to disturb the snoring siblings beside you. You reach for the warmth of your partner, hands chapped from the fields, breath smelling faintly of ale and cabbage. And for a moment, just a moment, you forget the dirt floor and the fireless hearth. You're not thinking about survival or sin. You're just human. Now trade your muddy boots and cabbage breath for soft slippers and rose water. Tonight, you're not a peasant, you're nobility. And while you might think that means a lavish, candlelit sex life filled with passion and privacy, well, don't put on the silk just yet. Because even here, in the high halls of a castle, sex is less about desire and more about duty. Political alliances, land disputes, bloodlines. You're not getting married for love. You're getting married because your father needs a border secured, or because the king said so, or because your dowry included 3 goats and a vineyard. Your wedding gift is a legal contract, and if you're lucky, a decent-looking spouse who knows how to dance. You're dressed in layers of brocade and wool, lace-up sleeves, and undergarments that take 2 servants to remove. Your partner? Probably equally corseted or armored. And the bed? Oh, it's beautiful 4-poster, draped in velvet, maybe even a carved headboard. But privacy? Still laughable. If you're lucky, you have your own chamber. But don't forget, your marriage is public property. Nobles are expected to prove it works. Quickly, let's talk about consummation. It wasn't just expected, it was witnessed. Sometimes not directly, thankfully, but servants were often posted just outside, instructed to listen for proof that the couple had done their part. And if no child arrived within a year or 2, people started whispering. Was she barren? Was he impotent? Did they even like each other? Impotence, by the way, was a serious accusation. If someone claimed a man couldn't perform his husbandly duties, courts got involved. Historical fact alert. In 13th century France, the impotence trial was an actual legal proceeding, complete with doctors, clergy, and occasionally a demonstration of performance in front of witnesses. Yes, witnesses. That's one performance review you can't fake your way through. But behind the embroidered curtains and duty-bound expectations, some nobles did find their way to passion, just usually not with their spouse. Affairs were common, especially in the courts. Court ladies and knights shared more than poetry. Servants caught whispers through keyholes, and secret notes were hidden in embroidery and jewelry clasps. There's even a documented case of a noblewoman who hid love letters in hollowed-out wax fruit. Think of it as medieval texting with fewer emojis and more risk of being executed for treason. Because if your affair involved the wrong persona rival family, a royal bloodline, it wasn't just scandalous. It was dangerous. Still, passion was craved. And suppressed passion breeds creativity. Hence the rise of courtly love. We'll get deeper into that next time. But let's just say it was a way for nobles to flirt within boundaries. Poems, longing glances, elaborate gift-giving. A performance of desire without actual consummation. Like sending a million flirty DMs, but never actually meeting up. But even in arranged marriages, sometimes sparks flew. A noble couple might grow close over time. They might enjoy long conversations, shared meals, even genuine affection. And when the guards weren't posted too close and the gossip hadn't gotten too loud, they might even find moments of intimacy. Here's the quirky detail. In noble households, sex was scheduled. Not just by the couple, but often by advisors or even astrologers. That's right. Before you got busy, someone might consult the stars to find the most auspicious night. Preferably not during a full moon, or right after a solar eclipse. Venus in retrograde? Forget it. Clothing didn't make things easier. Removing noble garb was a 10-minute process involving multiple layers, and at least one lady in waiting. So yes, if you wanted a spontaneous moment of passion in the tapestry room, you either needed to plan ahead or just work around the laces. And once again, the church was there, hovering, whispering, watching. Not literally, of course, but you couldn't escape the moral codes. Even as a noble, you were expected to follow the rule sex within marriage, primarily for procreation, with as little pleasure as possible. It was a spiritual duty, not a bodily indulgence. But historians still argue whether these rules were followed or just formally acknowledged, while everyone winked and did as they pleased. Some believe that behind the stern public faces, noble courts were actually hotbeds of desire, just carefully masked in etiquette. Others argue that internalized guilt kept even powerful people in line, with secret confessions and lifelong regret tucked behind velvet drapes. Now let's talk about the bed itself. This isn't just a piece of furniture, it's a symbol. Wealthy couples had beds so elaborate they were considered heirlooms. High off the ground to avoid rats, covered in feather mattresses and draped in rich fabrics. But they weren't always cozy. Mattresses were uneven, sheets rarely washed, and the whole thing creaked like a haunted ship. Still, compared to a pile of straw, it was a dream. And occasionally, the noble bedroom was a theater. Ceremonial bedding rituals took place where guests would accompany the bride and groom to the chamber, say a prayer, and then file out, leaving behind awkward silence and the pressure of performance. Nothing gets you in the mood like your uncle lighting a candle and murmuring, "God be with you both." There's a darker side, too. For some noble women, especially those married off young, the bedroom was a place of fear. A girl as young as 12 or 13 could be legally wed, though consummation might be delayed for a few years, might being the key word. The power dynamics were brutal. Saying no wasn't an option. And for men, pressure, too different, but real. A nobleman's virility was tied to his legacy. No sons, no future. That pressure could warp any relationship. A soft touch turned clinical. Desire became calculation. Yet still, they found ways. Lovers passed secret notes during hunts. Stolen moments happened in gardens, cloisters, quiet alcoves. There's even a record of one nobleman who disguised himself as a friar to sneak into his lover's quarters. Shakespeare would have been proud. And even centuries later, traces of their longing remain, carved into oak, pressed into letters, woven into the margins of their illuminated manuscripts. We may never know the full stories, but the whispers are there. So as you settle under silk sheets in your cold stone chamber, consider this. In a world where love was rarely the goal, it still found cracks to bloom through. Even among nobles, trapped by duty, hemmed in by politics' desire, found a way. You awaken to bells ringing again soft at first, then louder, as if even time itself is trying to shame you. Because in this world, the church doesn't just govern your Sundays, it governs your body. And when it comes to sex, it has some thoughts. Actually, a lot of thoughts. Some of them written down in exhausting detail, in books longer than the Bible itself. This is the part of your medieval life where everything becomes a theological minefield. You may have desires, but your body is on lease from God. You may be married, but even your wedding night has a rule book. In fact, it's not when you can have sex, it's mostly when you can't. Let's go over that again. Sundays are out. So are Wednesdays and Fridays, because those are fasting days. So is Saturday, as it prepares for Sunday. Then there's Lent, all 40 days of it. Advent, Yep, off limits. The days leading up to communion? No way. Holy feast days, the entire Easter season, and basically any time a priest looks at you funny? Not happening. You've essentially got a 2-day window in May and possibly a Tuesday in October. It's all part of what's known as canonical impediments, real set of laws that mapped out when and how sex was allowed. Missionary only. No face-to-face talking, preferably in the dark, and definitely no laughter. If you smiled afterward, you'd better confess it. This obsessive micromanagement wasn't just about controlling sin. It was about preserving order. The medieval church believed the body was the battleground of the soul, and sex especially, sex that felt good, was the easiest way for the devil to get his foot in the door. Or in the bed. Which brings us to confession. Medieval confession was like therapy. If your therapist judged you and gave you a penance involving dry bread, barefoot pilgrimages, and 30 days of cold water, you didn't just admit to bad behavior, you had to list it, specifically. Clergy manuals from the 13th century offered checklists that included questions like, did you lust after your spouse? Did you climax before your spouse? Did you enjoy it too much? Did you attempt any unorthodox positions? And the punishments? Let's just say they rarely involved a stern talking to. Depending on your station, you might be ordered to fast for days, give up sex for a year, or wear a scratchy hair shirt under your robes as a daily reminder of your shame. But here's a bizarre twist. Priests themselves were often guilty of what they preached against. While officially celibate, many clergymen kept mistresses, fathered children, and paid hush money in chickens. That's not a joke. Sometimes it was literally chickens. One quirky record from 14th century England tells of a priest who was caught with a lover, publicly flogged and reassigned to a monastery 3 towns over. A gentle slap on the wrist. So, while you're being fined for holding your wife's hand too long, Father Thomas is out back composing love poetry in Latin. Now, let's not leave the ladies out. Women bore the brunt of moral scrutiny. A woman's body was seen as inherently tempting, inherently weak, and always in danger of inviting sin. That's why so many sermons warned against female lustas, though it was a fire that could burn down entire villages if unchecked. Historians still argue whether these warnings reflected real concern or were just projections of male anxiety. Some point to how often women were painted as seductresses in religious texts: Eve, Delilah, Salome. Others argue it was about control, plain and simple. Control the women, and you control inheritance, labor, and most importantly, scandal. And speaking of scandal, remember the forbidden positions? That wasn't just rumor. Actual texts like the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas and later the Penitentials detailed acceptable versus sinful acts in frightening precision. Rear entry was out. Oral was unmentionable. Anything that didn't lead directly to procreation considered sodomy. Even married couples could be accused of sin within their marriage if they took too much pleasure or showed excessive affection. Imagine trying to make love to your spouse, only to be lectured afterward by a guy who's never even held hands. But here's where it gets strange. Despite all this repression, sex remained a massive undercurrent in religious culture. Medieval art often included very subtle, sometimes not so subtle sexual imagery. Monks doodled naughty jokes in the margins of sacred texts. Some churches even had carvings of naked figures on the outside walls, known as shilanagigs, supposedly to ward off evil. But, sure, There's a reason scholars call the medieval church obsessed with sex. They wrote about it, worried about it, outlawed it, forgave it, punished it, forgave it again, and in doing so, they kept it constantly alive in people's minds. Fringe tidbit time. There were even instructions given to clergy on how to detect if a couple was enjoying themselves too much. The presence of laughter, too much time alone, or, scandalously, a couple actually liking each other could be warning signs of excess. One bishop in the 12th century warned that a wife who smiles too much may be tempting demons. Sounds like he was fun at parties. Still, people pushed back, quietly. They built little rituals of resistance. A couple might bless their bed in secret. They might exchange tokens under cover of religious gifts. And for many, confession became a negotiation. You confessed just enough to show humility, but not so much that you drew suspicion. The church's reach was vast, but not absolute. In the villages, the towns, the long winter nights, it couldn't hear every sigh or stop every stolen kiss. People whispered in corners. They held hands when no one looked. They dared to laugh. Even in a world of sin and surveillance, humanity slipped through. So tonight, as you kneel for prayer and then climb into bed, you're not just seeking warmth. You're navigating a labyrinth of fear, ritual, and hope. You light your candle, whisper a prayer just loud enough to be heard, and then maybe, just maybe, slide closer to the person you love. Quietly, carefully, and hope no one tells the priest. You press your back against cold stone, your breath shallow, listening. The corridor outside is quiet for now. You slip through the carved doorway, heart pounding, into the flickering shadows of a noblewoman's chamber. The flicker? Candlelight. The pounding? Not from fear, but from something closer to excitement. Because tonight, you're part of a tradition older than chivalry. Courtly love, where sex isn't exactly forbidden, but it is off the menu. At least officially. Courtly love is the medieval version of a long, agonizing situationship. Picture this. You're a knight, sworn to a lady who's married to someone else. You fought wars, written poems, maybe even jousted in her honor. But physical intimacy? Not allowed. Instead, you suffer beautifully. You pine. You perform heroic deeds. You write songs with 72 stanzas about the curve of her eyebrow. This entire tradition came out of 12th century southern France, from the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine and other elite women who, quite frankly, were bored. Their husbands were off crusading or politicking, and suddenly, romantic fantasy became the hottest thing in circulation. These women elevated emotional tension into art, and suffering became a virtue. Mainstream fact: troubadours, medieval lyric poets, wrote thousands of verses about longing, desire, and the pain of not being able to consummate their love. These poems were circulated among courts, sometimes performed aloud, while the object of affection blushed politely and made absolutely sure her husband wasn't in the room. It was a performance of purity and restraint. To love someone deeply without ever touching them was seen as the highest expression of refinement. Think of it as the medieval slow burn. No kissing, no touching, just intense eye contact across a banquet hall and maybe a stolen glove or embroidered kerchief to cling to in your bunk that night. And yet, people being people, they touched. Not all courtly love stayed chaste. The line between idealized longing and actual physical intimacy blurred quickly, especially in places where servants were too afraid or too paid to snitch. Historians still argue whether courtly love was mostly literary fantasy or if nobles really lived out these flirty, forbidden relationships. Some claim it was mostly metaphorical, a way to express the hunger for divine connection, transposed onto earthly love. Others argue that it masked affairs behind the sheen of poetic virtue, like saying, it's just a poem when everyone knows it's about someone. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. One set of 13th century love letters discovered in an abbey included not only steamy verses, but also precise timing instructions for when to meet at the orchard wall. So yes, even the most refined romantics snuck out for some extracurricular gardening. Now, back to your modern-minded time traveler. Imagine navigating a relationship where even holding hands could spark rumors, where glances last too long, and someone's already composing a ballad about it. You couldn't openly admit desire, so you cloaked it in allegory. You didn't say, I want you. You said, your virtue is a beacon to my soul. Subtle. The language of love became code. The flower blooms only for the moonlight might mean, meet me at midnight. Or it might mean the poet was just really into horticulture. That was the trick. Plausible deniability, all wrapped up in flowery metaphors. Courtly love elevated the woman as a goddess-like figure, often unattainable and morally pure, which, while flattering on the surface, also came with pressure. She had to remain aloof, but not cold, responsive, but untouchable, flattered, but never too much. It was a constant performance. If she slipped even a little, her reputation could be destroyed. And for the knight, he had to balance strength with submission, bold in battle, but meek in love. He was expected to serve his lady, often quite literally, fetching things, delivering messages, even kneeling for hours just to win a smile. It wasn't exactly a power fantasy. It was more like romance, by way of endurance sport. Yet these relationships, imagined or not inspired generations of art, tapestries, songs, even early novels. The theme of forbidden love crops up everywhere, from Arthurian legends to Renaissance plays. Think Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde. Always beautiful, always doomed. And those stories? They echoed reality more than you'd think. Illicit relationships were common in the courts. The constraints of marriage, especially arranged political unions, left plenty of emotional space for passion to bloom elsewhere. A noble woman might never leave her estate, but her letters could travel miles. And knight might ride to war, but keep a secret token tucked near his heart. One nobleman in 14th century Italy was caught writing erotic poetry to two different court ladies. His excuse? It was for the muse, which is medieval for I panicked. So yes, sex was present in courtly love, just not always visible. Sometimes it happened in coded whispers. Sometimes it happened behind heavy doors. And sometimes it didn't happen at all. Just longing, frustration, and a verse that ends with alas. Still, that longing had a purpose. It was safe to desire someone you could never have, safer than risking scandal, exile, or death. Because make no mistake, nobles caught in real affairs could be punished severely. Women might be banished to nunneries, men exiled or executed. And if you had the wrong affair, say, with a rival's spouse or a royal's lover, your next romantic gesture might be from the gallows. So you sit by a window, pretending to read a psalter. Across the courtyard, your knight glances up. Just once. That's all it takes. No words, no touch. Just a flicker of understanding. A moment suspended in time. You turn the page, heart quietly racing. The game continues. You're walking down a narrow, uneven cobblestone street, careful not to slip where chamber pots were emptied just hours earlier. A crooked sign swings on rusty hinges above your head, a crude painting of a flower, or maybe something more suggestive, depending on how tired the artist was that day. Somewhere a lute plays, badly. Welcome to the medieval city after dark. The taverns are spilling out with laughter, someone's singing off key, and the town crier is probably drunk. But beneath the laughter and ale-stained wooden beams, something more hushed, more transactional is happening. This is where sex becomes business. Not behind closed doors exactly, but within plain sight, just ignored when convenient. The church condemns it, the city regulates it, and everyone else? Well, they keep showing up. Because like almost everything in the Middle Ages, the story of sex work is tangled up in contradiction, survival, and a very flexible definition of morality. You see her now leaning in the shadow of a doorway, the soft glow of a tallow candle behind her. She's dressed plainly, but her bodice is just slightly looser than a respectable woman's. Maybe there's a flash of red ribbon in her sleeve, or a patterned scarf, a subtle sign of her trade. She doesn't approach you. That would be illegal in most cities. You're expected to approach her, and if you do, she'll nod toward a curtained entrance down a side alley. And this is no backroom operation. Brothels in the Middle Ages were often sanctioned by the city. That's your mainstream historical fact right there. Many towns, especially in places like Paris, London, and Florence, operated brothels with official licenses. They were taxed, inspected, in theory, and regulated just like any other public establishment. It wasn't about encouraging sex work, it was about controlling it. Channeling male desire into predictable, taxable zones to protect good Christian women from temptation and assault. These zones were often located on the outskirts of town, near the city gates or docks, places with high male traffic and low official scrutiny. A sailor, fresh from sea, straight to the bathhouse. A student from the university, probably halfway through writing a love poem and planning a visit already. A nobleman, pretending he's incognito, wearing a hood that covers about 20% of his face. Inside, conditions varied wildly. At the high end, you'd find something almost comfortable. A few velvet drapes, maybe a tub large enough to sit in, incense to cover the smell of sweat. The madam might serve wine. A lute player might pluck softly in the corner, trying not to listen too closely. At the low end, well, a straw mattress, a bowl of rinsed herbs, and maybe a curtain for privacy, if you're lucky. The smell? A heady mix of tallow, sweat, musty wool, and whatever cheap perfume could be brewed from rose water and vinegar. Sex workers often lived in the brothel itself, or nearby. The madam or bawd, as she might be called, was usually an older woman who'd either aged out of the work or been savvy enough to take charge. She kept things running, paid the bribes, managed disputes, and sometimes acted as confidant and guard dog all in one. And yet, for all this organization, sex workers had little protection. They could be beaten by clients, arrested by city watchmen looking for scapegoats, or scapegoated for theft, disease, or anything else that went wrong in a man's night out. Their word meant little in court, and their reputations were permanently stained even if they left the trade. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. In some cities, sex workers were legally required to wear distinctive clothing. In Venice, they had to wear yellow scarves. In Toulouse, striped hoods. The idea was to prevent them from blending in with respectable women. But of course, not everyone followed the rules. Some blended in quite deliberately. After all, scandal could be profitable. The clientele ranged from the predictable to the peculiar. Merchants, soldiers, dock hands, wandering minstrelsies, but also monks, clerics, and priests. One 15th century record from Florence revealed that more than half of all brothel clients were clergy members. And no, this didn't cause much surprise at the time. The church disapproved publicly, then quietly tolerated it. Confession booths must have been very busy on Mondays. Which brings us to the big contradiction. Sex work was seen as sinful but essential, a necessary evil. Theologians like St. Augustine argued that without sex work, society would fall into chaos. Better to have a designated outlet for male lust than risk respectable women being pursued. So they allowed it, contained it, and blamed the women for it all in one breath. And yet, not all sex workers were passive victims. Some gained real social mobility. A successful madam might buy property, bribe her way into good graces, even retire comfortably. Some women learned enough reading and math to run their own books, negotiate deals, and avoid ruin. A few even managed to purchase manumission legal freedom from former debts or servitude. Still, survival often depended on wit, alliances, and extreme caution. Pregnancy was a constant risk. Herbs like pennyroyal, rue, and tansy were used as medieval contraceptives or abortifacients, though their safety was questionable at best. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they poisoned the user. But options were few. There were also male sex workers, though they were far less discussed. Most catered to wealthy women or men seeking same-sex encounters, an arrangement that carried much higher risks. Homosexual acts were explicitly banned by church law and could lead to public shaming, imprisonment, or even execution. Yet they happened, quietly, repeatedly, behind heavy curtains and whispered prayers. Historians still debate how common these encounters were. Some believe they were widespread, just rarely documented. Others argue that we project modern ideas onto a society with different categories of affection and desire. Either way, the reality is more nuanced than most medieval textbooks would admit. And let's not forget the class dynamics. Some women entered the trade by choice, at least initially. Others were coerced, tricked, or outright sold. Orphaned girls, widows, refugees from war or plague. A woman alone in a medieval city had few options. Domestic service, begging, marriage, or sex work. And marriage wasn't always safer. But even in brothels, women created their own small communities. They looked out for each other, shared remedies, and built systems of mutual protection. Some passed on songs, charms, even rudimentary medical knowledge. One brothel in 14th century London reportedly kept a house book of clients who were dangerous or didn't pay. No Yelp reviews, just a shared sense of survival. In Nuremberg, there was even a municipally run brothel in the early 15th century aimed at reducing sexual violence. The women were paid salaries and even given days off. It was shut down later not because it failed, but because it worked a little too well, and reformers got nervous about the government being in the sex business. So here you are, standing at the edge of that flickering red-lit street. You're not a saint. You're not a sinner. You're just one more body moving through the shadows of a world where desire is bought and sold, and sometimes where a moment of connection slips through anyway. Because even here, in the alleyways of a medieval city, someone might look you in the eye, say your name, touch your hand a little longer than necessary, and maybe, just maybe, for a few minutes, it's not about coin or power or survival. It's just human. You wake up to a rooster crowing and a donkey braying, not because you live on a farm, but because animals roam the streets like they own the place. You rub the sleep out of your eyes, stretch, and remember today is bath day. Or, rather, you hope it is, because when it comes to hygiene in the medieval world, it's a toss-up between belief, availability, and sheer luck. Let's be real. You smell. Everyone smells. The baker, the blacksmith, the lady in silk nobodies winning any fragrance awards. But body odor doesn't mean people didn't care about cleanliness. They absolutely did, just not in the way you might expect. Contrary to the myth that medieval people were total strangers to soap and water, public bathhouses were common in many towns, especially before the 16th century. In places like Paris, Cologne, and London, bathhouses called stews in England were as much social hubs as they were places to wash up. Picture a bubbling cauldron of hot water, steam rising, naked bodies lounging around, chatting about politics and prices, and probably making jokes about the monk who forgot his towel again. And here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 13th century, nearly every major city in Europe had multiple bathhouses. People paid a small fee to enter, could request towels, oils, and even attendants to help scrub their backs. They even brought snacks sometimes. A bath and a pastry? Not bad. But of course, like everything else in medieval life, bathhouses weren't just about hygiene. They were multi-purpose. They became hangouts, flirtation spots, and yes places for extracurricular activities. Some doubled as brothels, which got the church very twitchy. By the 15th century, many bathhouses were seen as morally suspect. You couldn't tell whether someone was going in for a good wash or a good time. That ambiguity led to a lot of finger-wagging from religious authorities. Sermons warned of bathing with sinful intention. Some cities passed laws requiring men and women to bathe on separate days or at separate hours. Others tried to shut them down completely. But the demand never really went away. People liked bathing, especially in winter, when the bathhouse was one of the few places that was warm. And while the public baths were lively, not everyone could afford theme or wanted to risk the gossip. So many people bathed at home, if they had the means. A large wooden tub, hauled in and filled with buckets of warmed water, often reused by the whole family. Yes, the classic "don't be the last one in the bath" cliche. Totally real. First the father, then the mother, then the children, in descending order of age, and by the end, you're basically bathing in tea. Soap existed too, though it was harsher than what you're used to. Made from animal fat and lye, it smelled a bit like scorched bacon and could take off the top layer of your skin if used too enthusiastically. But hey, exfoliation is timeless. Now let's talk hair washing. It was rare. Conditioning, even rarer. Instead, people combed it thoroughly, sprinkled it with herbal powders like lavender or rosemary, or wrapped it up entirely. Lice? Commonplace. There were even lice combs passed down like heirlooms. Fancy. As for dental hygiene, well, you had options. People used cloths to scrub their teeth, chewed on mint, sage, or fennel seeds, and sometimes rubbed ashes or crushed charcoal on their gums. There were even early toothpastes made from honey and ground oyster shells. Did it work? Sort of. Did it taste good? Absolutely not. Now, bodily cleanliness aside, What about sexual hygiene? That's where things get more complicated and way more inconsistent. Most people knew that sex could lead to disease, even if they had no idea how or why. The connection between intercourse and illness was murky, but the symptoms were unforgettable. Itchy boils, burning sensations, festering wounds, the so-called French disease, now believed to be syphilis, began spreading across Europe in the late 1400s. But even before that, medieval physicians described venereal ailments in vague, terrifying language. Treatments ranged from herbal poultices to mercury rubs to sweating out the humors in hot rooms that smelled like regret. But some precautions existed. Bathing after sex was recommended by some physicians, not for disease prevention, but to rebalance the body's humors. There was also a belief that certain foods, before sex, could increase passion. Onions, wine, almonds, while others dulled it. Cold water, vinegar, beans. Scholars and doctors argued over this constantly. Historians still debate how effective or widespread these ideas were. Some say they were mostly confined to elite households and medical texts. Others argue that word-of-mouth traditions meant even commoners had basic understandings of what to do after a risky night. Here's your quirky fringe tidbit. In parts of 14th century Italy, some women used wool soaked in vinegar or lemon juice as a kind of primitive barrier methods, like an early tampon sheet diaphragm hybrid. It wasn't comfortable. It probably wasn't very effective. But it shows how clever and resourceful people were, even without modern science. Speaking of cleverness, let's revisit your morning. After your hopefully warm bath, you might rub yourself down with scented oils if you're wealthy, or dried herbs if you're not. You slip into fresh linen, which serves not just as underwear, but as your main barrier against body filth. Outer garments don't get washed often, but under linens, crucial. And now, you're ready to face the world again clean, slightly damp, and hopefully not infested. You might stop by the market, where soap sellers hawk their wares next to fishmongers. Or visit the apothecary, where dried rose petals are sold in paper packets for breath freshening. The medieval hygiene industry is thriving, just not in a way that would pass modern inspection. Yet for all the patchwork rituals, people weren't indifferent to dirt. Cleanliness was associated with health, status, and even morality. Priests preached about the purity of the body, reflecting the purity of the soul. Lords built private baths into their estates. Some towns even installed public fountains to provide cleaner water, though the pigs usually got there first. Sure, you might still stink by modern standards, but within your own world, you're doing okay. You've bathed, scraped, brushed, rinsed, and powdered. You've done your part. And tonight, if someone draws near you, they might catch the faintest scent of thyme or chamomile and smile. Because in a world where so much is hard, fleeting, or out of your control warm water, a clean shirt and a moment of softness can feel almost sacred. You're lying flat on your back in a loft, staring at a wooden ceiling covered in cobwebs. A mouse scurries across a beam overhead. The straw mattress beneath you pokes through the thin linen sheet, and the person next to you, your legally wedded spouse, snores like a wounded ox. Ah, yes, married sex in the medieval world. Less romantic poetry and more livestock scheduling, with occasional candles. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't really about love. It was about land, labor, alliances, and heirs, especially heirs. Whether you were a peasant or a noble, the expectation was the same. Marry someone appropriate and start producing children as quickly as possible. Romantic attraction was considered a happy accident, not a requirement. And when it came to sex, marriage was both a duty and, believe it or not, a contractual obligation. Your mainstream historical fact: in many places, the church recognized a marriage as valid only if it was consummated. No sex, no marriage. The act itself sealed the deal. If one partner refused to participate in intercourse, the other could appeal for annulmentan escape hatch from an otherwise permanent union. And this wasn't just highbrow canon law. Peasants knew it too. Local courts, both religious and secular, heard complaints from spouses who were denied their marital rights. One frustrated wife in 14th century England famously dragged her husband to court because, in her words, he lay beside her as a brother. Ouch. But how often did married couples actually have sex? That varied. In general, more than today's cliches suggest. Medieval people weren't prudes. They just had a lot of rules about when sex was acceptable. Want to get frisky on Sunday? Too holy. Feast day? Forbidden. During Lent? Absolutely not. Advent? No way. Pregnant? Better not. Menstruating? Not allowed. Just gave birth? Wait 6 weeks? It adds up quickly. Some historians estimate that devout couples may have abstained up to half the year due to religious restrictions. That's a lot of pent-up energy and a lot of cold feet in shared beds. Still, people found their windows. Married sex was supposed to be private, modest, and strictly for procreation, but behind closed shutters, couples were probably a little more human than the manuals admit. The church didn't exactly police position or frequency, though the most conservative guides recommended the missionary position as the most respectable. Anything else standing, side by side, or, heaven forbid, from behind, was seen as edging dangerously close to sin. Which leads to one of the great contradictions. Sex within marriage was considered virtuous when done for children, but shameful if done just for pleasure. You were supposed to restrain the flesh, even while actively using it. It was like being told to eat cake without enjoying the frosting. Now, for your quirky fringe tidbit, one 12th century church manual warned that if a man enjoyed the act too much, even with his wife, it might count as a sin unless he immediately repented. Yes, that's right, post-coital confession was a real thing. The medieval version of Netflix and guilt. Of course, all these rules fell harder on women. A man's desire was natural, even expected. But a woman who seemed too interested? Suspicious. A wife was meant to be obedient, not enthusiastic. Passionate wives were either praised in hushed tones or accused of being witches. And speaking of suspicion, virginity was a massive deal at marriage. For women, anyway. A blood-stained bedsheet was often displayed the morning after a wedding night, especially among the nobility. It proved the bride's chastity and her family's honor. No blood? Scandal. Some women reportedly pricked their thighs or staged fainting spells to sell the illusion. It wasn't about truth, it was about survival. Meanwhile, male virginity was not really a thing. A groom with experience was considered lucky, skilled, worldly. A woman with the same? Dangerous. It's a double standard as old as time, and medieval Europe absolutely embraced it. Now let's talk about age gaps. Most peasant marriages happened when both parties were in their late teens or early 20s. But among the nobility, young girls, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, were married off to much older men, especially if politics or land were involved. Actual consummation was often delayed, but not always. In royal courts, girls were prepared for married life by older female relatives who taught them prayers, etiquette, and how to endure their wedding night. You, dear time-traveling listener, would probably not enjoy this aspect. You'd likely find it upsetting, understandably so. But in the medieval mind, biology and morality didn't always match up. Fertility was prized above emotional maturity. A girl who could bear children was ready. And that idea shaped countless marriages, loving or not. Historians still argue whether marital sex was mostly duty or if affection played a larger role than we've assumed. Court records and letters reveal a wide spectrum. Some spouses were tender, protective, even affectionate. Others were cold, neglectful, or abusive. And just like today, many fell somewhere in the middle, a little routine, a little warmth, a lot of compromise. There are even surviving love letters between married couples that show real connection. A merchant's wife in 15th century Germany wrote to her husband during a long business trip, "I miss your voice, your laugh, and the way your hand finds mine under the table. Sweet, and rare enough to be preserved like a jewel." Still, the daily reality for most married women was less romantic. Sex was expected, especially during fertile years. Refusing your husband without good reason could be grounds for punishment or social backlash. A woman who denied her marital duties could be shamed publicly or even labeled rebellious. Her feelings? Secondary. And yet, some women pushed back. They negotiated, delayed, faked illnesses, took long visits to relatives during Lent. Inventive excuses were an art form, and sometimes they simply endured, emotionally checking out while their husbands went about their rights. It wasn't all bleak, though. Many couples found companionship, shared a laugh, cuddled on cold nights. Some grew fond of each other over time, especially if they survived childbirth, plagues, and famine together. Trauma, after all, is a powerful bonding agent. But let's not pretend it was all mutual joy. For countless women and not a few men, married sex was an obligation they couldn't decline. Consent, as we understand it today, didn't really exist in law or culture. If you were married, consent was presumed. Silence was not just golden, it was expected. So you roll over, pulling the wool blanket up to your chin. Your spouse stirs, mutters something about milking the goats, and settles back into snoring. You stare at the ceiling again, listening to the dawn break over a world where love and duty, pleasure and guilt, comfort and obligation were constantly overlapping. And maybe, just maybe, tonight will be one of the good nights. A shared smile. A hand held a moment longer. No pressure. No expectations. Just a flicker of warmth in the dark. You find yourself navigating a crowded medieval marketplace where the air is thick with the mixed aromas of freshly baked bread, sweaty livestock, damp straw, and the unmistakable stench of unwashed bodies. The chatter of vendors, the clatter of wooden carts, and the occasional braying donkey create a noisy symphony that fills the narrow cobblestone streets. Amidst this chaotic scene, you overhear a hushed conversation about the Lord's mistress. Apparently, she has just arrived in town, and the whole village is buzzing. Welcome to the medieval world of prostitution, a profession that was as much a part of daily life as taxes, festivals, and blacksmithing. Contrary to modern assumptions, sex work in the Middle Ages wasn't a shadowy underworld hidden from public view. Instead, it was a visible, regulated, and sometimes even institutionalized part of society. While the church condemned prostitution as sinful, most local governments tolerated it, viewing it as a necessary outlet to prevent greater moral chaos, such as adultery or violent sexual crimes. Medieval authorities understood that completely eradicating sex work was impossible, so they often imposed rules to control it rather than outlaw it outright. Your mainstream historical fact: by the 13th century, many European cities had designated districts where prostitution was legally permitted and regulated. These red light districts were recognized and taxed by local authorities. For example, in medieval Paris, the infamous Rue des Moulins was well known for its concentration of licensed brothels. Cities like London, Cologne, and Florence had similar arrangements, where sex workers were required to register with city officials and abide by certain rules, such as curfews and health checks. Yet, despite official toleration, the realities of medieval brothels were far from glamorous. Imagine cramped, dimly lit rooms with threadbare curtains, foul odors lingering from poor sanitation, and the constant flicker of candlelight casting shadows on rough stone walls. The clientele ranged widely: traveling merchants, soldiers on leave, local laborers, and occasionally even clergymen with a taste for forbidden pleasures. It's worth noting that sex workers weren't exclusively women-some men, especially in busy port cities, worked as prostitutes, though this was far less common. Regulations on brothels could be surprisingly detailed. In some towns, sex workers had to undergo regular medical examinations to monitor and control venereal diseases, which were a serious concern even back then. Public drunkenness, brawling, or violent behavior in brothels were punishable offenses, as officials sought to maintain order. Still, enforcement was inconsistent. During religious festivals or disease outbreaks, authorities might shut brothels down temporarily, only to reopen them once the crisis passed. Here's your quirky tidbit. In certain towns, prostitutes were legally required to wear distinctive clothing or badges, such as a specific color hood or a silver ring, to publicly mark their profession. This practice functioned as a social control measure, preventing respectable women from being mistaken for sex workers and reinforcing the social boundaries. Imagine a medieval name tag saying, "Yes, I'm here for business," except far less friendly. Despite these measures, the social stigma attached to sex work was severe. Prostitutes often lived on the margins of society, excluded from respectable social circles, and vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and legal persecution. Many women were pushed into the trade by poverty, debt, or lack of other employment options, though some managed to gain a degree of independence and even wealth by running or owning brothels. The church's stance on prostitution was complicated and somewhat pragmatic. Officially, prostitution was a sin and morally condemned. However, many clergy accepted it as a necessary evil that prevented worse sins like adultery or sexual violence. Some theologians argued that licensed prostitution helped maintain social order by channeling male desire into controlled outlets. Historians still debate whether this tolerance reflected genuine moral compromise or just cynical pragmatism. Public health concerns added another layer to the issue. After syphilis appeared in Europe at the end of the 15th century, brothels became targets for blame and crackdowns. Authorities often closed them during epidemics, fearing that sex workers were spreading disease. However, these closures were usually temporary, and brothels reopened once the immediate threat subsided, highlighting the entrenched nature of the trade. Sex workers themselves developed survival strategies to cope with their precarious lives. Many carried charms or amulets believed to protect them from disease and misfortune. Folk remedies using herbs like sage, rosemary, and vinegar rinses were common methods for attempting to cleanse after sexual encounters, blending superstition with practical hygiene. This cocktail of belief and pragmatism was a hallmark of medieval medical thinking. While sex work was undeniably dangerous and stigmatized, it could also offer financial independence and a certain degree of power. In bustling cities and trade hubs, some prostitutes and madams accumulated wealth, invested in property, and supported themselves and others. Not all sex workers were impoverished. Some navigated the complex social and economic landscape to carve out successful niches for themselves. Outside of cities, rural sex work existed too, often informally and without regulation. Taverns, inns, and crossroads were common meeting points for traveling soldiers, pilgrims, and merchants to find local women willing to exchange sex for money or goods. These encounters were riskier, with fewer protections and greater social vulnerability, but they were an undeniable part of rural life. Language around sex work had its own colorful vocabulary. Words like wench, harlot, courtesan, and mistress each carried different connotations and social status. While some terms were derogatory, others suggested a certain prestige or sophistication, especially among courtesans who might enjoy noble patrons. Understanding these distinctions helps unpack the complicated social hierarchies tied to medieval sex. As you move away from the market toward a quiet well, you spot a woman sitting alone, her basket filled with herbs and linens. She watches the gossip and bustle with knowing eyes. Perhaps she once walked the streets of the red light district herself, or maybe she simply trades stories about the Lord's mistress, the brothel raids, and the secret dealings that shape village life. As twilight descends and the sounds of the market fade, you realize that medieval sex wasn't just a private act between two people. It was a public, messy, and often dangerous business entangled in social norms, economics, religious beliefs, and health fears. And in a time without privacy, as we know it, everyone had a stake in the story, even if only as a voyeur, a judge, or a survivor. You walk slowly into the bedroom of a modest medieval home. It's dim, the only light coming from a stub of candle resting in a cracked iron holder. Shadows dance across cold stone walls. There's a straw-stuffed mattress on a low wooden frame, rough linen sheets, and the faint but ever-present scent of smoke, sweat, and something vaguely herbal lavender maybe, or rosemary, tucked into corners to keep out fleas and evil spirits. Welcome to your wedding night, or at least what passes for one in the Middle Ages. You won't find rose petals, gentle violins, or heartfelt toasts here. Medieval marriage and sex were part religion, part social contract, and part sheer obligation. And if you think romance was the point, you probably wouldn't survive your first year as a spouse. Marriage in the Middle Ages had very little to do with love. For most people, especially among the nobility, it was a transaction, a binding agreement negotiated by parents, uncles, or village elders. It was about land, property, alliances, and the continuation of bloodlines. Your body, whether male or female, was a tool to preserve family legacy. And your sexuality, it was more or less public property, your mainstream historical fact. By the 12th and 13th centuries, noble children were often married off while still extremely young, sometimes as early as age 7 or 8. These were formal betrothals, often cemented with legal documents and religious ceremonies. Actual cohabitation and consummation might wait until puberty, but not always. Historians still argue whether consummation was delayed in practice or simply overlooked in the legal record, especially if the match brought significant political or financial gain. Among peasants, things were less formal, but still deeply rooted in communal and religious expectations. Villages often required approval for marriages. In many places, you needed the blessing of both the church and your manorial lord. And once married, sex was not just allowed, it was expected. Failure to consummate a marriage could be grounds for annulment. You lie on that straw mattress, and the truth hits you. Marital sex in the medieval world was mostly about duty, not desire. The church taught that the primary purpose of sex was procreation. Pleasure wasn't exactly outlawed, but it was definitely frowned upon if pursued for its own sake. The idea was to get in, do your sacred reproductive job, and get out without enjoying it too much. That didn't stop people from trying to make it a little more bearable. And here's your quirky tidbit. There were actually medieval sex manuals. Yep, written by clergy. These guides included recommendations on frequency. Not too much, not too little. Positions. Missionary was safest. And timing. Avoid Sundays, feast days, Lent, and Fridays so. Basically, most days. Some even recommended specific herbs believed to enhance fertility or arousal, things like fennel, mint, and even boiled hip bones from animals. Don't try that last one. But while the church promoted a rigid framework for marital sex, human behavior had other plans. Affairs, premarital trysts, and secret liaisons happened with astonishing frequency. Yet the consequences were far from equal. For women, especially noble women, any hint of sexual impropriety could ruin reputations, cost inheritances, or lead to severe punishment. Men, on the other hand, were granted much more leniency, especially if they were powerful. A nobleman keeping a mistress was often an open secret. In fact, in some courts, mistresses wielded real influence. Medieval law, when it came to sex and marriage, was often invasive and weirdly specific. If a couple's union was challenged, courts could summon them to prove consummation. Yes, sometimes with physical examinations, and yes, sometimes with witnesses. If you're squirming a little, that's the correct response. Let's talk contraception. Yes, it existed. No, it wasn't reliable. Medieval people used everything from wool soaked in vinegar as a primitive sponge to herbal concoctions designed to prevent or terminate pregnancies. But most of these were discouraged or outright banned by the church. Controlling reproduction was seen as interfering with God's will. Historians still debate how widespread these methods were, but midwives and wise women definitely passed down such knowledge, even if they risked accusations of witchcraft. Sex wasn't just biological, it was deeply medical too. According to the popular humor theory of the body, sex could be good for your health if done in moderation. Too much sex could weaken the spirit, cause melancholy, or even madness. For women, it was sometimes prescribed as a cure for hysteria, a diagnosis applied far too liberally to any woman who dared to be emotional or difficult. But then again, if a woman enjoyed sex too much, she could be labeled unnatural or even demonic. Can't win, right? Here's where it gets messier. Marriage didn't guarantee exclusivity. While polygamy was technically illegal in Christian Europe, Serial monogamy, multiple marriages over time, was common, especially due to high mortality rates. Many people remarried quickly after a spouse's death. Nobles, in particular, were expected to remarry if a wife died before producing a male heir. In some cases, they didn't even wait for the funeral bread to go stale. The double standard ran deep. Women caught committing adultery faced public shaming, loss of property, or worse. In some towns, they were paraded through the streets or locked in public cages. Husbands, meanwhile, often faced little more than disapproving looks if they strayed unless their affairs caused political problems. And yet, there was tenderness in the margins. Some letters between spouses, especially when one was away at war, or court reveal longing, even affection. These rare emotional threads remind us that not all marriages were cold calculations, but such instances were uncommon, and even then, they were always bound by the tight web of societal duty. Romantic love, that lived mostly in stories. Courtly love, a literary invention of the 12th century, portrayed noble knights pining after unattainable ladies, often married ones. It was poetic, idealized, and almost always non-physical. These tales had enormous cultural influence, but rarely translated into real-world marriage practices. In reality, falling in love was a luxury few could afford. So here you are, lying next to someone you probably didn't choose, under covers that smell like boiled wool and stale air, doing your best to fulfill your role as a spouse in the eyes of the church, the village, and your extended family. Love, lust, and longing have all been reshaped into sacred duty and social necessity. Medieval sex, within marriage or out, was tangled up in rules, rituals, expectations, and fear. It wasn't about personal satisfaction, it was about order. And surviving it, especially as a woman, meant navigating a minefield of judgment, danger, and pressure. You adjust your position on the straw mattress. It pokes through the linen and scratches your leg. Someone coughs outside. You realize that in this world, intimacy was rarely private and rarely safe. Still, people found ways to make it work awkwardly, painfully, sometimes even joyfully. But mostly, it was just expected. Another task, another rule to follow, and absolutely no room for privacy or complaints. You step through the heavy wooden door of a stone chapel tucked into the corner of a bustling medieval village. Sunlight spills through the stained glass, painting dusty beams of red and gold onto the cold flagstone floor. Its quiet inside soothing, sacred and yet behind these serene walls, the church has wielded enormous influence over what people do in bed. In fact, when it comes to sin, confession, and bedroom behavior, the church has more rules than you've ever imagined. And yes, there were priests asking very, very personal questions. The church in medieval Europe wasn't just a place of worship, it was a totalizing force, dictating how you lived, worked, married, and yes, how you had sex. Whether you were a peasant laborer or a noble knight, your bedroom behavior was seen as either righteous or sinful. There wasn't a lot of wiggle room in between. Sex wasn't just private business. It was moral business, with consequences that could follow you to the grave and beyond. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 13th century, the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, made annual confession to a priest mandatory for all Christians. That meant once a year, at least, you had to sit down with a clergyman and tell him about your sins. And sin, according to church doctrine, included almost every sexual act that wasn't strictly marital, missionary, and for the purpose of procreation. So if you enjoyed yourself, too much confession time. The church didn't just frown upon premarital sex and adultery. It also took a deep interest in what you were doing even inside your marriage. Sex during Lent? Sinful. On holy days? Also sinful. On Sundays? Definitely sinful. And don't even think about anything unnatural, which could mean anything other than the missionary position. The church had an entire catalog of forbidden acts, many listed in penitentials manuals for confessors that outlined what sins to ask about and how many prayers to assign as penance. One quirky tidbit. According to some penitentials, specific sexual sins had delightfully precise penalties. For example, having sex in the wrong position might require 3 years of penance. Oral sex? That could be 7 years or more. Even thinking lustful thoughts about someone who wasn't your spouse could earn you a harsh sentence of fasting, prayer, or pilgrimage. Imagine having to walk barefoot across Europe because of a particularly spicy dream. So what exactly happened during confession? Picture yourself sitting across from a priest, and he's not just asking about theft or gossip. He's asking, did you have intercourse with your spouse during a forbidden time? Did you lust after someone? Did you commit the sin of self-pollution? Yes, that meant exactly what you think. Some confessors were painfully detailed in their questioning, believing it their holy duty to root out all impurity. It's enough to make you sweat under your wool tunic. The goal wasn't just repentance, it was control. The church believed regulating sexual behavior would lead to a more orderly, moral society. But it wasn't always consistent. While strict in theory, enforcement often depended on your class, your location, and just how much the priest liked you. Nobles could get away with more than peasants. Men more than women. As usual, power determined how tightly the rules were enforced. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed everything the church taught about sex, or if they simply paid lip service while quietly doing whatever they wanted behind closed doors. Sermons and confessions were one thing, real life was another. People found ways around the rules, with coded language, secret liaisons, or good old-fashioned denial. I didn't know it was Lent. Father, might have been a common excuse. But don't assume everyone was a rule breaker. Guilt was real. Many people feared damnation deeply, and the thought of eternal punishment for sexual sin weighed heavily on their minds. The imagery of hell in medieval sermons was vivid, often fixated on lustful punishment, flames, demons, and shame. One 12th century preacher claimed that women who tempted men would hang by their hair in hell. A bit dramatic, but effective. The confessional became a kind of spiritual microscope, peering into every corner of human desire. Some priests used it as a chance to offer comfort and forgiveness. Others wielded it more harshly, keeping tight control over their communities by policing their most intimate behaviors. And yes, some were corrupt, using confession to manipulate, shame, or even abuse. The church's influence didn't stop at the confessional. Religious plays, sermons, and illustrations constantly reminded people of the dangers of lust. The figure of the fallen woman became a moral warning seductive, dangerous, and destined for eternal suffering. Sexual purity, especially for women, was a sacred ideal. Virginity was prized not only for spiritual reasons, but as a marker of family honor and economic value. A noble woman's virginity could determine the worth of her marriage contract. And yet, the church also offered paths to redemption. Repentance was always possible, no matter how serious the sin. Pilgrimage, charity, prayer, and penance could restore your soul. Some even joined monasteries after a sinful youth, dedicating their lives to purity as a form of atonement. Still, the line between guilt and control often blurred. Was forgiveness truly the goal, or was obedience? Despite the heavy hand of doctrine, you'd be surprised how many medieval people managed to find their way around the rules. Secret marriages, quiet trysts in barns or woods, and even confession loopholes were not uncommon. Human creativity, it turns out, thrives under pressure. As you sit in the pew, looking up at a faded fresco of angels and demons locked in eternal battle, you realize that sex in the Middle Ages wasn't just an act, it was a battleground for the soul. Every desire was weighed, judged, and measured against divine expectation. And yet, people still loved, touched, longed, and sinned. Because even when the church made the rules, the human heart still had a mind of its own. You wake up in a noisy medieval town square, surrounded by shouting vendors, clanging bells, and children chasing chickens through the mud. But today, the crowd has gathered not for market day or a saint's procession, but for a trial. Someone has been accused of adultery, and everyone wants to see what happens. This is the public stage where infidelity, punishment, and public shame play out. And trust me, you do not want to be the one wearing the iron collar today. Infidelity in the Middle Ages wasn't just a private betrayal. It was a social and legal offense, one that could break up families, threaten political alliances, and spark scandal at every level of society. While the church preached sexual purity and marital fidelity, local customs, gender, and class often determined how these expectations were enforced or ignored. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. In many medieval towns, legal codes had specific penalties for adultery. These could range from fines to corporal punishment, and in some cases, public humiliation rituals. In parts of France and Germany, adulterers were paraded through the streets, sometimes stripped to the waist, wearing signs around their necks declaring their crime. In England, a common punishment for women was being placed in a scold's bridle, a metal cage for the head with a plate to silence the tongue, or even being ducked in a river. Men, of course, were treated more leniently. A cheating husband might face a small fine or be told to make peace with his wife. A cheating wife? She risked public exposure, loss of property, or even death, especially if she belonged to the nobility. Noble families had reputations and inheritance to protect, so a wife's infidelity could be considered treason against the bloodline. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, communities held charivari rituals when they suspected marital discord or adultery. Picture this: villagers banging pots, playing horns, and singing rude songs outside the accused's home all night long. The idea was to shame the couple or sometimes force reconciliation through loud, chaotic mockery. Think of it as a medieval remix of public shaming and unwanted couples therapy. But it wasn't just your neighbors you had to worry about, it was also the church. Confessors were required to ask about adultery during confession, and church courts handled a wide range of cases involving infidelity, bigamy, and even emotional betrayal. Yes, even writing love letters to someone who wasn't your spouse could get you summoned. If caught, punishment could include fasting, pilgrimages, and public repentance. Picture yourself walking barefoot to a distant shrine with a sign around your neck that reads, "I have sinned with Margaret from the mill." Adultery accusations often became tangled with politics and power. Queens and noblewomen were especially vulnerable. Take the infamous case of Marguerite of Burgundy, who in the early 14th century was imprisoned for allegedly cheating on her husband, the future King Louis the Thickeners of France. The scandal rocked the royal court and led to executions, political purges, and widespread gossip. Historians still argue whether Marguerite's guilt was real or fabricated to remove her from the line of succession. In village life, adultery could tear apart communities. Honor was collective, and if your spouse cheated, it wasn't just your shame, it was your family's, your villages, sometimes even your guilds. This communal obsession with sexual reputation meant that even the whiff of infidelity could lead to gossip, isolation, or revenge. In some towns, women suspected of adultery were forced to carry heavy stones through the streets or to wear their husbands' breeches on their heads as a mark of shame. Subtle? Not at all. And speaking of subtlety, there was little of it in medieval punishment. Some towns built cucking stools where accused adulterers were tied up and dunked repeatedly into cold river-smart punishment, part purification and entirely humiliating. Others used pillories, stocks, or iron collars locked in place outside churches, so everyone walking past on Sunday could take note. It wasn't just justice, it was spectacle. Yet for all the fire and brimstone, people still cheated. Secret affairs happened in castles and cottages alike. Some were driven by love or lust, others by politics, desperation, or opportunity. Traveling merchants, knights, clerks, even priests often led double lives. One man in 14th century Italy reportedly had two wives, one in the countryside and one in town, and rotated between them like a medieval work schedule. Women, too, found ways to bend the rules, especially in urban settings where anonymity was easier to maintain. Inns, bathhouses, and festivals offered cover for brief, risky encounters. Some kept tokens from lovers' ribbons, carved trinkets, even locks of hair as secret mementos. But the consequences of discovery were nearly always worse for them than for their male counterparts. Some communities tried to avoid public shaming by resolving matters privately. A cheated spouse might accept a quiet payment in land or coin to keep the matter from going to court. In other cases, people simply looked the other way, especially if the adulterer was rich, powerful, or well-liked. Still, the fear of exposure loomed large. Gossip traveled fast, and reputations could be ruined in a single market day. A glance held too long, a poorly timed visit, or a servant with a loose tongue could bring everything crashing down. You could go from respectable wife or honorable husband to scandalous outcast overnight. Even literature of the time reflected society's obsession with betrayal. Tales of unfaithful wives and occasionally duped husbands filled popular songs, fables, and morality plays. These stories served both as entertainment and as cautionary tales. Don't be like her, they warned, or you'll end up ridiculed, ruined, or roasting in hell. As the trial in the town square comes to a close, the accused woman is led away in shackles, jeers following her like smoke. Somewhere in the crowd, a man smirks. He walks free, untouched, his reputation intact. The rules of shame in the medieval world were never fair, but they were brutally effective. Public humiliation didn't just punish individuals, it sent a clear message to everyone watching. And as you fade back into the crowd, heart pounding and hands clammy, you realize something chilling. In this world, infidelity isn't just a private failing, it's a public event, a communal drama where everyone plays a part. And surviving it? That takes more than forgiveness. It takes power, luck, and a very short memory. You stumble into the shadowed corner of a village tavern. The scent of ale, wood smoke, and something decidedly sour clinging to the air. Candles gutter on the tables, and a group of travelers huddle by the hearth, telling stories that aren't fit for church ears. If you want to know where people really hooked up in the Middle Ages, you won't find answers in prayer books. You'll find them here, in places where the line between sin and survival blurs, and where rules are optional if no one's watching. The public face of sex in the medieval world was all about morality, marriage, and restraint. But behind closed doors, or rather, behind poorly latched ones, things were far more complicated. Despite church warnings and harsh penalties, people still found ways to satisfy their desires. The Middle Ages were full of loopholes, hidden corners, and makeshift arrangements for those willing to take the risk. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. Prostitution was not only present in medieval society, it was tolerated, taxed, and sometimes even regulated by city governments. In places like London, Paris, and Florence, municipal brothels existed with official oversight. The idea was simple. If men were going to seek out sex, it was better, according to the authorities, that it happen in a controlled environment than out in the streets, threatening the virtue of respectable women. These regulated brothels were often tucked just outside city walls or near marketplaces, where travelers and locals alike could visit discreetly. Women who worked there were required to wear specific colors, often yellow hoods, or striped garments, so they could be easily identified. That didn't protect them from judgment, of course. While their services were used by many, they were still socially shamed, often excluded from guilds, church rites, or burial in consecrated ground. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some cities, brothels had quirky names like the Cardinal's Hat, the Bellyful of Wine, or even the Unicorn's Tail. These places weren't always sordid hovels. Some had musicians, warm food, and shared baths. A night out might involve music, flirting, and then, well, a bit more. But brothels weren't the only place people met for casual encounters. Inns, bathhouses, and taverns were all common sites for temporary passion. Bathhouses, in particular, offered a peculiar mix of hygiene and hedonism. Public steam baths were widespread in medieval Europe, especially before the Black Death hit in the mid-14th century. Men and women often bathed together, and it wasn't just about getting clean. Relationships, some short-lived, some transactional, were often negotiated in the steam. You wander into one such bathhouse stone walls, slick with condensation, wooden tubs filled with warm water and rose petals, and conversations muffled by steam. It smells of lavender and old timber, and the occasional giggle drifts through the air. It's far from scandalous here. In fact, for many, it's normal. That is, until local clergy begin cracking down, denouncing bathhouses as dens of sin and closing them during moral panics or plagues. For those without coin to visit brothels or bathhouses, nature provided its own options. Rural trysts happened in barns, fields, and forests. Lovers met during festivals, dances, or religious pilgrimages moments when supervision was relaxed and spirits were high. May Day festivals, in particular, had a reputation for romantic encounters, often just far enough from the village to allow for a bit of privacy. But privacy, of course, was always relative. Medieval homes were small, shared, and drafty. Most peasants lived with extended families in one-room cottages, with livestock sometimes sleeping under the same roof. Courting couples had to be creative and quiet. Some traditions, like bundling, where a man and woman lay together in bed, sometimes separated by a board or in sacks, were meant to encourage bonding without, too much bonding. Historians still argue whether bundling was genuinely innocent or just a very clever excuse. If things went too far and someone became pregnant outside marriage, the consequences varied. In towns, such cases could result in fines, forced marriages, or public penance. In rural areas, communities might turn a blind eye, especially if the couple eventually wed. But for women, particularly poor women, the risk was always greater. An illegitimate child could lead to permanent social exclusion or even abandonment. Still, people adapted. Secret marriages, known as clandestine unions, were surprisingly common. A couple would declare themselves married in front of witnesses, or even alone, and consider it binding. While the church preferred formal weddings, canon law allowed for such unions to count at least until reforms cracked down in later centuries. It was a legal loophole and a romantic one. Speaking of loopholes, pilgrimage was another avenue for unexpected romance. Thousands of people journeyed across Europe each year to visit relics and holy sites. And while many were pious, others saw pilgrimages as a chance to travel, mingle, and escape the watchful eyes of home. Some jokingly referred to these trips as holy honeymoons. After all, when you're on the road, who's going to know if that companion you're walking with is your spouse or not? And of course, love didn't always follow heterosexual norms, though it was far more dangerous for those who strayed. Same-sex relationships existed. There are records of clerics, nuns, and lay people involved in such partnerships. But they were dangerous to acknowledge. The penalties range from excommunication to execution, especially as church doctrine hardened in the later medieval period. Still, scholars find traces in letters, court cases, and poetry whispers of desire that dared not speak its name. You exit the tavern and walk through narrow alleyways where the air is heavy with cooking smoke and summer heat. Somewhere nearby, a secret is being kept. A rendezvous is about to happen. A girl has snuck out after curfew. A young scribe waits behind the stables. And the world keeps turning. Despite all the rules, people loved. Clumsily, bravely, sometimes foolishly, but they loved. And wherever they found warmth in brothels, bathhouses, fields, or backrooms, they carved out brief moments of intimacy in a world that so often denied them comfort. Because even in an age of sin and sermons, desire was stronger than shame. And sometimes, that was all people had. You're now sitting on a rough-hewn bench in a smoky hall, watching a weary midwife tend to a pale young woman curled on a straw-stuffed mattress. There are no glowing monitors, no epidurals, no quiet music playing in the background. Just the sounds of labor-ragged breathing, whispered prayers, the occasional scream muffled by a cloth, and the stern gaze of a priest waiting just outside the room in case the baby doesn't survive. Welcome to the terrifying, exhausting, and deeply sacred world of pregnancy, birth, and survival in the Middle Ages. Becoming pregnant in medieval times was both expected and dangerous. For most women, marriage meant motherhood early, often and repeatedly. A typical peasant woman might bear anywhere between 5 and 10 children over the course of her life, though only a fraction would survive into adulthood. Death in childbirth was so common that it was considered a routine risk, not a tragedy. And if you were hoping for prenatal vitamins or birthing pools, you might want to lower your expectations. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Maternal mortality rates in the Middle Ages were staggeringly high. In some regions, between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 births ended in the mother's death. There were no antibiotics, no knowledge of antisepsis, and no surgical safety nets. A woman's best hope lay with her midwife, a local, often older woman, who had delivered dozens or hundreds of babies, guided by experience, herbal knowledge, and sometimes desperate improvisation. The midwife brought more than skill. She brought a small arsenal: oils to anoint, salves to ease pain, herbs to calm nerves or stimulate labor. Some women drank mixtures of mint, fennel, or pennyroyal. Others wore talismans or holy relics, such as pieces of a saint's robe or a parchment bearing the Lord's Prayer, sewn into a pouch and tied around the belly. And here's your quirky tidbit. One common labor charm involved writing the words Jesus, Mary, Anna on 3 pieces of cheese, eating one during early labor, one mid-labor, and one just before the final push. Sounds tasty. Maybe. But the birth room was more than medical, it was spiritual. Women were often encouraged to confess before labor, just in case they didn't make it. If the baby was in distress, or the labor prolonged, a priest might be called to perform an emergency baptism immediately after delivery, or sometimes even during delivery. Historians still argue whether in utero baptism was a literal practice or more symbolic, but the fear of dying unbaptized was very real. And if you think things got easier after the baby arrived, you might want to sit back down. Newborns faced astronomical mortality rates. Some estimates suggest that 1/3 of infants died before age 1, with many more not surviving childhood. Diseases, malnutrition, and infections claimed lives fast and often silently. For this reason, baptism was usually performed within hours or days of birth, no matter how fragile the infant. In some towns, midwives were granted special permission to perform emergency baptisms if no priest was available. Once a child survived, the mother's recovery began, though rest wasn't really part of the plan. Women were expected to return to household duties fairly quickly, depending on their class. Wealthier women had wet nurses to assist, but peasant mothers nursed their own and returned to chores with the baby strapped to their back. There were postpartum rituals too. Women were considered ritually unclean for a period after childbirth, usually 40 days, after which they were brought back into the church through a ceremony called churching. It was a kind of spiritual re-entry into society, sometimes celebratory, sometimes shaming. Now let's talk about fertility control. You might be thinking, surely they just kept having children until they died? Well, mostly. But some couples, especially poorer ones, did try to space out births or avoid pregnancy. Withdrawal was a known, if unreliable, method. There were also herbal remedies believed to reduce fertility or induce miscarriage. Rue, pennyroyal, and tansy were among the most frequently used, though they were toxic and risky. And yes, there were whispered folk remedies, from amulets to fertility dances to drinking wine stirred with a silver spoon at certain moon phases. Some of it was wishful thinking. Some of it maybe worked a little. Yet discussing these methods openly was dangerous. The church condemned any attempt to prevent conception, considering it an affront to divine will. Women who were known to use abortive herbs could be accused of sorcery or meddling with life. Midwives walked a thin line irrevered for their knowledge, but always one complaint away from suspicion. Their tools and books were sometimes seized as evidence during witch trials. And remember, Most pregnancies were not exactly a choice. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime, and a woman's body was often seen as her husband's right. Some church leaders even wrote that a woman refusing sex could be committing a sign unless she was ill or pregnant. Even then, it was a gray area. Power imbalances were the norm, not the exception. Still, amid all this, women formed networks of support. Other mothers, sisters, neighbors, and midwives provided crucial care, both practical and emotional. Birth was a female-dominated world. Men were usually not present, except in cases of noble births or emergencies. And in those sacred hours, surrounded by the scent of lavender, sweat, and holy oil, women shared stories, passed on wisdom, and fought quietly for survival. Sometimes, childbirth brought status. A woman who bore many healthy children, especially sons, could earn respect, security, and even a touch of reverence. But the opposite was true too. Barrenness, or the suspicion of it, could ruin a woman's standing. Some were cast aside by husbands seeking more fertile wives. Others were accused of curses, punished for imagined sins, or left isolated in their communities. So here you are, kneeling beside the mother, handing her a wet cloth, whispering encouragement in the flickering candlelight. The baby cries at last, a thin, wet sound that draws a collective breath of relief from the room. For this night, this child has survived. The mother breathes. The midwife packs up her kit. The priest returns to his duties. You step outside into the cool air, where the stars wheel silently overhead. Behind you, another woman is already in labor. In this world, birth is both miracle and minefield, a sacred trial that every woman must face again and again. And survival, it's not promised. But somehow, they keep going. You're back in the manor house, the day's heat finally giving way to evening chill. Outside, a servant tugs close the shutters, and someone's lighting a fire in the hearth. You wander through dim halls where candles flicker in iron sconces, catching glimpses of embroidered tapestries and dark wood carved with curling vines. Tonight's topic: marriage, power, and the strange politics of sex, because in the Middle Ages, who you married or didn't marry could determine everything: your fortune, your safety, your place in the world, and, yes, your access to any kind of decent sex life. Let's make one thing clear. Marriage in medieval times wasn't about love, or at least not primarily. It was about property, status, alliances, and heirs. Romantic love was the stuff of poems and troubadour ballads, fine for courtly flirtation, but not practical when land and bloodlines were at stake. Your parents, your lord, or even your king often chose your spouse for you. You just smiled and tried to survive it. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the High Middle Ages, the Church had effectively taken control of marriage law across Europe. It declared that a valid marriage required free consent of both parties, but in practice, that didn't always stop forced matches. Girls as young as 12 and boys at 14 were legally old enough to marry, though actual ages varied depending on social class and region. Among nobles, early marriage was a strategic move. Among peasants, it often waited until a couple could afford a household. That idea of free consent? A nice theory. In reality, family pressure, social norms, and financial necessity often left little choice. A noblewoman might be shipped off to marry a man 3 times her age in another kingdom. A village girl might be told to accept the cobbler's son because the families had agreed on a shared cow. And once you were married, getting out was nearly impossible. Divorce, as we understand it today, didn't exist. The church permitted annulments under very specific conditions, usually involving non-consummation or pre-existing vows, but these were rare and often reserved for the elite. Which brings us to power and how sex was used to gain it, keep it, or deny it. Marriage was a transaction, and in many cases, so was sex. A woman's virginity, especially among the upper classes, was considered her family's capital. Her body was literally part of the inheritance system. That's why bridal sheets were sometimes inspected after the wedding night to prove consummation and honor. No pressure, right? And here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, there were actual court cases brought against husbands who couldn't perform their marital duties. If a nobleman's wife claimed he was impotent, both parties might be summoned before a judge. The man could be forced to undergo an examination, or even a public performance test. Yes, as mortifying as it sounds, a team of matrons might observe and report back. Historians still argue whether these tests were common or exaggerated, but the anxiety they caused was very real. Marriage wasn't just about controlling women's bodies, it also gave men a legal right to sex. Within the church's strict moral framework, married sex, in the proper position, at the proper time, for the proper reason, was acceptable, even blessed. But anything outside that boundary, adultery, homosexuality, masturbation, was sin. Marriage was the only sanctioned outlet. But if your marriage was cold, cruel, or loveless, too bad. You were expected to endure it, for better or worse. For noble women, marriage meant navigating a dangerous tightrope. Their job was to bear heirs, manage estates, and behave with perfect modesty. But they were also expected to wield influence quietly, to counsel husbands, run households, even command troops in their absence. A powerful wife might be praised unless she overstepped. Then she risked accusations of witchcraft or poison. Love her, but not too much. Trust her, but not too far. Among peasants, things were a little less formal. Couples often cohabitated before marriage, sometimes for years. These informal unions could be legally binding if witnessed and later acknowledged. While marriage was still serious business, love had a little more room to breathe, especially when there wasn't much property to fight over. Still, disputes over inheritance, legitimacy, and household control often boiled over into the courts, especially when land was involved. And then there's courtly love, the poetry and songs of knights and ladies, sighing from balconies and passing secret notes under silk pillows. It was romantic, yes, but also performative. Many courtly lovers were already married. Their flirtations were symbolic a way to express longing and virtue while avoiding the messiness of real sex. Though let's be honest, some of those symbolic glances probably ended behind a curtain now and then. Marriage could be a prison or a partnership. It all depended on luck, class, and who held the power in your household. Some couples grew to love each other deeply. Others just tolerated the situation. Some especially powerful women found ways to bend the rules, to shape their fate within the confines of a system that never really had their interests in mind. And as you walk through the manor's great hall, the last candles burning low, you see them. Ghosts of marriages past, a noble woman in pearls and silence, a blacksmith's wife carrying water in the gray light of dawn, a girl clutching her wedding token, heart pounding in a stranger's bed. Their stories, their choices, their power plays, they all mattered. even when the world tried to forget them. Because in the end, sex in the Middle Ages wasn't just about pleasure or procreation. It was about survival, about alliances, about who got to control their own story and who had to pretend they didn't want one. So now, the fire's almost out, and the manor is quiet. You tuck yourself into that itchy straw mattress under a heavy wool blanket, listening to the slow crackle of the last embers and the distant hoot of an owl in the trees. The clamor of medieval life, the gossip, the judgment, the whispered desire, it all fades into a low hum, like voices behind a curtain, waiting to be forgotten until morning. You made it. Somehow, through the hunger, the hierarchy, the rituals and rules, the candles and cloisters, you survived a world where even love was dangerous, and the simple act of wanting someone could change your fate. There were no guarantees, no protections, just the thinnest thread of choice stretched between faith and fear. And still, they loved. They kissed in corners. They scribbled clumsy poems. They slipped hands beneath laced bodices. And sometimes, just sometimes, they found joy where they weren't supposed to. Human connection survived even that age of iron discipline. It always does. Now, let your breathing slow. Let your muscles sink. You've walked through centuries of shadows, but here tonight there are no more confessions to give. Just the quiet, just the peace, just the cool hush of another time slipping back into stillness. You've learned a lot, maybe too much. But your journey's over now. End of story. Sweet dreams.